All right, well, let's talk about your top story tonight, which is what's going on in Ukraine. Well, the lies in Ukraine are starting to be exposed. It was only a matter of time, really. Remember all of those volunteers and all of those mercenaries who were headed to Ukraine, to join up with the Ukrainian army, to fight Russians, those U.S. Marines, former members of the U.S. Army, those battle-hardened warriors who were heading to Ukraine? Well, it turns out most of them are leaving. Or were never in the Marines at all, or were never in the Army at all. They were lying. Now they're being investigated for fraud, ripping people off to the tunes of millions of dollars. Isn't it amazing how they'll set up GoFundMe accounts and people will send money and then they'll rip people off? That's how it happens. So we'll get to that part of the story in a moment, which is stunning. But first, could we be about to see peace in Ukraine? Could this whole thing finally be over? Well, the stars are starting to align. Today, Ukrainian President Zelensky is now admitting and doubling down on this, admitting that Ukraine is now officially out of bullets. Kind of a big thing in war when you don't have bullets. Like you could use bayonets, you could fix bayonets. But in an interview he had with a Japanese newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun, the journalist, Zelensky talked about a lot of things, but the biggest item that he let slip is that Ukraine is out of bullets. And then he kind of drew a line in the sand. And I thought this was really probably the most important point he made. He told the newspaper that Ukraine won't launch a counteroffensive until the West sends more weapons and ammunition. We're not going to do it. We're not going to be used. We're not going to be marching forward. We don't have anything left.
You know who's not out of bullets? The people that got the 70% that don't make it to Ukraine.
Right. Yeah. What happened to all of the weapons we have sent? All of the ammunition we have sent? Oh, I know. Now it's in the hands of Al-Qaeda. It's showing up in Africa.
But I'm confused by this no counteroffensive. Does it mean that they just stand there as cannon fodder?
Pretty much.
But they're still going to hold the line. They're not going to retreat
What
the U.S. State Department and John Kirby was saying, hey, we can't let Russia rest. Right. So we need to keep pounding on them. And so Ukraine is clearly not going to rest, even though what they're saying here indicates that they could stink and use some rest.
Yeah. What this means, I guess, is, the remaining, whoever's left in those trenches, like, in Bakhmut and these other areas that have been surrounded, we'll just use them as cannon fodder. We'll use them until the last Ukrainian, because that's what the United States policy is on this, right? Whatever remaining Ukrainians are still there, we'll just use them as cannon fodder. And as we've talked about on this show, we talked last week here on the show, we are not saying that the Ukrainian army is running this war. It's not. They're gone. The Ukrainian army's, toast. So this is NATO 100%. Now they're boxed into a corner, right? They're out of ammunition. They don't have any weapons. So what is NATO supposed to do now? They're screwed. They're literally screwed. And, I have to say there's two things here that stand out from this interview from Zelensky. Number one, Ukraine has no army any longer. So what the hell is he even talking about? The people doing any kind of counteroffensive would be international NATO forces. They would be Polish forces, UK forces, US forces, mercenaries, Legion, it'd be Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters who've now joined the front and joined Ukrainian forces a few months ago. So it puts the onus now fully on NATO. After peace talks, you can either do peace talks or dump a whole bunch of new weapons, new money into Ukraine.
And personnel.
Yeah.
You need to refresh the personnel.
You don't have anybody. And so this is going to be like a joke now because the Ukrainian army is gone. So you're literally going to have to, and that's why we're seeing NATO amassing about 300,000 forces getting ready, because Ukraine is done. So either you walk home with your tail between your legs now, or you send in hundreds of thousands of ground forces. You send in U.S. forces, British forces, Polish forces, and you literally complete the job that you set out to do, which was total eradication of Ukraine and using it as a proxy, using it as an aircraft carrier, as you said the other day.
To be fair, we've had there's been no confirmation that they've even started with big numbers. Like, we've never seen a single video or picture of anything of big number of troops on any kind of front line or anything in such a Western publicized war. Like, where are all the people they had initially? Like, we never saw them.
That's a great point.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Why have I not wondered about that before?
Well, yeah, it's a good point. And also, right, we've also talked here, we don't get to see videos from the front lines because the Ukrainian military has kept the Western media largely away from the front lines. They don't want you to see that at all, right? They don't want you to get an accurate accounting of any of this. And we should point out that the numbers on actually who is alive and who is dead are also missing in action, right? We've heard months and months ago, upwards of 300,000 killed on the Ukrainian side. Then we got official numbers that push it around 100,000. So then if the truth is somewhere in the middle, that is awful.
Yeah.
Absolutely awful. You've literally wiped away an entire generation of young people in that country. And now they're, of course, wiping away old people as well. And then even younger people who are not even of age. So you really have no one left. In this interview, Zelensky says Ukraine can't fall because then Russia will want to invade other countries. He says this. He said Russia has imperialistic goals. Okay, sure. What evidence, by the way, do you have that Russia wants to invade Europe? There is none. But my favorite moment in this interview comes later in the article where Zelensky completely contradicts the Russian that Russia wants to invade argument. So he flip-flops like 2 paragraphs later, and he says, talking about reluctance to send more weapons, he says, quote, "There is concern in the United States and European countries that providing weapons to Ukraine could lead to an escalation of fighting. However," Zelensky says, "I want to counter that notion. I would like people to stop getting scared by threats of the Russian Federation." Okay, so then which is it? So that Russia has imperialistic goals and tendencies and wants to basically take over the rest of Europe, or don't be worried about them. So you don't need to be scared about them. What is it? Then you have a whole, then you have a whole group of European leaders who are right now invited to China to talk peace. So this is amazing. I mean, talking about, think about where like the United States has fallen down.
Yes.
Here. They can't turn to the United States for peace in Ukraine at all. So they're meeting with Xi Jinping about his 12-part Ukrainian peace proposal. Whether you think it's flawed or not, I don't really care. It's the only peace proposal that's being talked about.
Seriously. Yes.
And so here is Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. He's going to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping this week. He said that he is grateful for Xi's invitation. And he says it's important to know his position on peace in Ukraine and to convey to him that it'll be the Ukrainians who establish the conditions for that peace. How exactly is Ukraine in a position to make any kind of conditions?
Well, I think what the marching line is, if you're marching in to talk about peace for Ukraine, what you're saying is, I no longer want my country to continue to foot the bill for this, but I have to say that no territory is off limits. Like the Donbass or Crimea. Like this is what Western leaders have to say. That's what Olaf Scholz said to, who was it at CNN?
For Farhid Zakaria.
Him. He said, Ukraine gets to decide what it keeps and what it doesn't. I mean, Ukraine did not get to decide to keep the Donbass or Crimea. Those people voted to be annexed and join Russia. But they continue to say, look, if Ukraine wants to keep this land, then we can't force their hand. Right. And so if this is not something they're willing to speak about peace for, then that's it. But we do want to talk about peace. So it's interesting because, you can say, I just want to stop supporting these people who have no real plan for peace. If they're not going to give up land they can't regain. But no Western leader is willing to say that. They're just kind of saying, we're not saying give up the land, but we're saying some peace. They're sort of speaking the forked tongue.
Well, and the real story is that Europe is being destroyed right now economically.
Yes.
Right. So and this is what you're hearing among the bureaucracy and the European leadership, which is, we're done. Like, we can't sustain this any longer.
Yeah.
And in many ways, this is the United States' proxy war. Why are we involved with this? They blew up our pipeline. Mm-hmm. We're paying 4 times the amount for energy.
Yeah.
The real story will be next winter when they can't pay, they have no stockpiles at all left. So next winter is going to be the real bad situation. And so they're like, wow, we got to do something here. All right, we'll meet with China, I guess. Brazil's president also, Lula da Silva, is going to meet with China this week, propose a peace club, with China.
Only the cool kids are in the peace club.
to mediate an end to the conflict in Ukraine. And then, not to be outdone, Emmanuel Macron, 80,000 euro watch-wearing Emmanuel Macron, is going to go to China next week, but he can't go by himself. He has to take hairsprayed Ursula von der Leyen. I have to imagine, like, her hair probably could stop bullets. It's that amount of hairspray in that thing.
Hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I bet. Or there's like bees living there.
But not in Ukraine.
But not in Ukraine. Yeah.
Well, she didn't wear a helmet when she went there, did she?
I think it's interesting, though, that NATO has pushed so hard to make the possibility of going back to the original borders impossible, because NATO has been pushing to get Ukraine as a member state. Yes. And so from Russia's perspective, that would just put NATO right on their front door. And so then they're like trying so hard to make that avenue of peace just completely impossible.
Even though Ukraine literally means borderland. That's the etymology of that word.
Right.
So, but the borders are what are being fought over at this stage.
Well, I love that we're so concerned about the borders there. As David points out here in the chat, says, like I said earlier, you need to talk about the young Chinese men of military age coming into the United States through the southern border. Well, the southern border is like a sieve, right? So we are concerned about Ukraine's borders, just not the United States borders.
Clearly.
At all. And by the way, I'm not praising China in any way at all. We've been highly critical of China on this show, and it certainly, I mean, all you need to do is go back to videos we talked about where they're rounding up people's pets and, awful stuff, and COVID and really, really awful stuff. But they're the only ones talking about peace, right? So if there's a peace proposal that can start to be a framework to end this thing where hundreds of thousands of people are being killed, then I'm on board with that. Like, let's start there and let's go from there. But the United States wants to perpetuate this thing for the next 10 years. And that's, we have a track record. Iraq, Afghanistan, the list is endless. So anyway, Macron is going to go there. He's going to meet with he's going to bring Ursula von der Leyen with him. And he's going to lay out the nature of the EU's relationship with China. And we'll see. We'll see if it actually could make a change here and actually have some peace.
I might have some optimism about that if he weren't bringing her. But as we were talking about earlier,
she probably called him up, right? He's going to go on his own, because all the horrible situations in France right now, protests, hundreds, tens of thousands of people on the streets, right? And
now's a good time to get away. Pull a Ted Cruz moment.
And it's not, by the way, just about the retirement age. It's about getting out of NATO, and it's about ending this war. That has been happening for months in France, the rest in Paris and other parts. It's gotten very little media attention. So a lot of the media attention has been like, oh, they're protesting about the retirement age. That's a piece of it. But for months now, there's been protests on the streets of Paris, ignored, and in Berlin and other places to end this war. I have to imagine, though, she probably got on the phone. She's like, Emmanuel, I know you're going.
I'm free that day.
I'd like to travel with you.
Yeah. As some are speculating, though, it's almost the same as bringing Joe Biden. Yeah. Because whatever he wants, she seems to be willing to do. And so that feels like a big wet blanket in that peace talk.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.